Now, the most common solution to dealing with asynchronous activities is to use threads, right? Basically, just create a separate thread from the main thread so that you can keep the user interface responsive. And they're great because whenever you do any kind of blocking operation, right, they don't block the user. And threads are, as a kind of a simple tool, are useful for a number of scenarios, but their usefulness is limited. For pretty much anything that takes too long to run inside of one of the event handlers, which basically means anything that takes more than 100 milliseconds or could potentially take more than 100 milliseconds, threads are useful for. But it's important to remember that threads within the Android platform are kind of, again, not the be-all and end-all, that they're only useful for things that are going to take up to a few seconds. And when I say a few, I kind of mean kind of like 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 sort of thing. Because a thread that runs for more than a few seconds can potentially be killed by the operating system before it finishes. And that's why we're going to talk a lot more about services later. But threads are a really valid tool for this kind of scenario where, it's not going to take too long, but it takes longer than I want to tie up the user interface thread. Now, when you're doing threading, whether you're doing it from a Java environment like Android or a Microsoft environment like .NET, most of the same issues still apply. Right, is that you want to make sure that you choose your threads judiciously. The issue of creating your own threads versus using pooled threads that can be reused. And a lot of the issues that come up in terms of dealing with the user interface. Right, these are all still important considerations. Now, when it comes to creating threads, the task itself is quite simple. Right? There's a thread class. You have to pass an implementation of the runnable interface to the thread class. And then that's the work you're going to do. And then inside, it's going to be with that thread you call start, and that actually runs the work. And again, no matter what environment you're in, all the same caveats apply. Right? If you have multiple threads working together at something, things like race conditions where things don't always happen in the same order or something changes just before you use it, those things are important to keep track of. Concurrent modification of values, right? If two different threads are working on one value, be sure you're aware of what's happening there. And the issue of frequently creating short-lived threads, right? That's an expensive thing to do, so we generally don't want to do that. Now, when it comes to threads and user interface, we kind of have this kind of classic problem. This exists in many platforms, is that you want to go ahead and run something on the background, so you create a separate thread to do it, but you want to inform the user of what's going on. And you have to do that, of course, on the main thread or the UI thread. So you always have this problem that if I'm doing work on a background thread, how do I inform the user interface of that activity? If you try to interact with a UI control from a background thread, depending on the version of Android you're using, you can get different results. The newer versions of Android will actually throw a proper exception and will say that you're trying to do a cross-thread access. Some of the older implementations of Android would just kind of have these undefined results. Yeah, it might work one time, might crash arbitrarily another time. So you just want to be really diligent about not interacting with the UI controls from background threads. To help us with that, Android gives us two helpful classes here, or excuse me, I say two helpful methods. The activity class has a run on UI thread method. If you call that, it always makes sure that code runs on the UI thread. If you're calling it from the UI thread, it will run directly. If you're calling it from an alternate thread, it will go ahead and do the thread switch for you. And another one, if you're just trying to interact with a single control, there's a post method. We'll actually send a message to that control's queue to actually perform the task that's described inside the method. And the easiest way to see this in action, of course, is look at a demo.